Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the IEA. I will be your host for the next hour. The economic situation that we in the UK and generally across the world find ourselves in is pretty bleak, not least the state of the government's finances. Last week, we found out that in April alone, the government borrowed more than £62 billion, significantly more than it was expected to borrow for the entire year before this crisis hit. In total, the OBR predicts the deficit for 2020 will reach close to £300 billion, 5 times higher than what was expected before this pandemic hit us. Many predictions suggest the total level of public debt as a share of national income is quickly heading for 100%. MPs of all stripes have said no return to austerity. They've urged the Chancellor not to raise taxes, nor to cut public spending. But growth predictions raise fresh questions over how Boris Johnson and his Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, will finance the emergency measures taken to battle the pandemic and the economic consequences of its aftermath. What's the best option? Is the usual playbook of free marketeers out of the window? What does the future hold for fiscal responsibility? Are we right to be sanguine that this is a one-off event we can afford for a short period of time to throw caution to the wind when it comes to government spending and government debt? So I'm thrilled to be joined by two absolutely fantastic speakers to address this question of how do we finance the government spending splurge footing the bill. We have Steve Baker. Steve, a very good friend of Freedom and of the Institute of Economic Affairs and one of the most principled politicians sitting in the House of Commons. He is, of course, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Wycombe, having represented the constituency since 2010. He was formerly chair of the group of Eurosceptic MPs, the European Research Group, and has also served as a minister in the Department for Exiting the European Union from June 2017 to July 2018. Steve, thank you for joining us. Good afternoon. And we're also joined by Professor Philip Booth, who is the Senior Academic Fellow here at the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham. Previously, of course, Philip was the Academic and Research Director here at the IEA. Philip, good afternoon.
Hello.
I'm going to ask each of them to present their early thoughts for about 7 minutes or so, kicking off with Philip. As I say, throw your questions into the Q&A box as they come to you. And Philip, we'll kick off with you.
Okay, I'm just sharing my slides and hope I've done that successfully.
You have.
You have, good, right, I have done. Okay, well, I wanted to hold this seminar really because there are just so many myths around about debt and government spending and what we should do after the COVID crisis is over. Hopefully it will be over in the not too distant future. And many of these myths are pervasive within the Conservative Party. And I'm hoping, of course, that Steve Baker will be an exception to that. Now, the 3 myths are as follows. Firstly, that government debt doesn't matter, that we can just carry on accumulating it and not worry about it because interest rates are low. More than one Conservative has repeated Ronald Reagan's ridiculous comment that the government debt is big enough to look after itself. This, of course, is nonsense. It needs to be small enough for us to be able to look after it. Secondly, that because the economy is in such a state of shock, the government must carry on spending to help keep the economy going post-lockdown. And thirdly, we cannot and should not have a period of austerity as things return to normal. So let me just deal with the first of these issues, and that's that of government debt. Now, as well as saying that interest rates are low, people argue that because we've had high debt before in history, we don't need to worry about it now. Of course, it's true that we have had very high levels of debt. This chart shows the levels of debt after the Napoleonic Wars, over 250% of national income, and after the First World War, and then after the Second World War, when there was another peak, roughly the same as that in 1815. It looks like on current trends that if we begin to go back to normal during the remainder of this calendar year, perhaps government debt will go up to about 130% in the current crisis. But your ability to manage government debt doesn't only depend on interest rates. It depends on 4 things. Real economic growth. The higher economic growth, the better. Interest rates on debt, obviously, that's been mentioned. The lower they are, the better. The primary fiscal surplus, in other words, the difference between what the government's spending and what it's taxing after taking off from spending interest payments, because we've already mentioned those. The higher the surplus, the better. And finally, inflation, the higher, the better. Now, post 1945, we had pretty strong economic growth, but the main important phenomenon there was inflation. The currency lost 98% of its value from 1945 to round about 1995. And the government got lucky there. Inflation was extremely painful, but normally we would expect that if inflation rises, it actually leads to higher interest costs, just therefore thus cancelling out any benefit of inflation. But even if it doesn't, in future years, when you have to roll over and resurface debt, if you have a history of high inflation, governments have to pay higher and higher interest rates in the following decades, and then that has an impact on generations to come. And so when inflation expectations became embedded in the 1970s, the government throughout the 1980s, and really all the way up until 1997, was paying inflated interest rates on its debt as a result. But quite frankly, the 1970s alone, that experience of inflation alone, was bad enough. We really don't want to repeat that. After the Napoleonic Wars, there was quite high economic growth as well. But the main thing was that there was a very large fiscal surplus, the difference between taxation and spending. But it's much easier to generate a fiscal surplus when the government is only spending 5% of national income than it is when the government is spending over 40% of national income. I don't see a fiscal surplus on the horizon anytime soon. And in fact, the Office for Budget Responsibility has suggested that if nothing changes due to demographic factors alone, debt will explode to 275% of national income in the next 50 years. So this is just because of the demographic crisis. Now, that was a prediction pre the coronavirus crisis. So if you add the coronavirus problems on top of that, you really do have a serious problem and a set of circumstances in which it will be very difficult for the government to generate a surplus over a period of 30, 40, 50 years. So it has to take action sooner. So I leave that question there and just move rapidly on to the other two issues. So issue 2, that the government should carry on spending because it needs to keep the economy going post the current recession. I think that's pretty easy to deal with. This is just a conceptual error. The economy has been hit by a supply shock, not a demand shock. People are spending less because they're earning less, or because they are prevented from spending by the lockdown conditions. You don't deal with a supply shock by increasing demand. You deal with it, as West Germany dealt with the problems after the Second World War, by liberating the supply side of the economy, so that the economy adjusts to the new patterns of demand as rapidly as possible. Whatever decisions are taken about government spending should be taken on the usual political economic grounds and not on macroeconomic grounds after a supply shock. Finally, let me say something about so-called austerity. It's argued by almost everybody, it appears, that we can't have another period of austerity, as if we've had one in the last 10 years. We haven't really. But let me be clear. If national income falls, as it has, and remains below trend, as it will for some time, we have to have one of the following three. Either private sector austerity, that is tax increases, compounding, which will simply compound falls in private sector incomes, public sector austerity to match the falls in private sector incomes, or austerity for future generations if we finance the spending by borrowing. There isn't a fourth option, except perhaps inflation, but that just creates austerity for savers and people who own assets instead. And the problem is that government spending is on an upward ratchet, if you like. Every time we have a crisis, government spending rapidly moves up to a new level and never really goes back down. So from the First World War until 1924, government spending rose by 18 percentage points of national income. From 1937 to 50, another 13 percentage points, after having been squeezed down a little in the interwar period. After the financial crisis, it rose by about 7 percentage points to over 50%. Even after the all the years of so-called austerity, we're still now above where we were before the financial crisis. We can't keep on doing this. Every time we have a crisis, a war or a supply shock, we can't just keep on increasing government spending till it reaches 100% of GDP. We have to rein government spending back in again. Not reducing spending following the crisis really involves accepting two things, and this is where I'll end. Firstly, it would involve accepting that private sector consumption and investment has to take all the strain of the crisis and the fall in national income at a time, after a 10-year period, in fact, when living standards have been rising only very slowly in the first place. Secondly, it involves accepting that if there is a long-term hit to national income and real wages in the private sector, if we don't restrain public spending, what we're really saying is that a fall in real wages in the private sector should have no implications for welfare payments, pensions, public sector salaries, or the amount we spend on healthcare and education as a proportion, and we should allow the amount we spend on healthcare and education as a proportion of GDP to rise as GDP falls. To my mind, these are untenable propositions. We cannot simply let the private sector take all the strain of the fall in national income. So in sum, Steve's colleagues have some pretty difficult decisions to take. My fear is that many in the Conservative Party are just assuming away the difficulties and saying, let's just carry on, print money, borrow money, and leave it all for the future. Thanks.
Philip, thank you very much indeed for that compelling, albeit very bleak picture. Just a reminder to all of you, if you, I think there's a question's already appeared, but if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll come to those after we've heard from our second speaker. Steve, where are you? Fiscal hawk, fiscal dove, realist, fantasist? What's your, are you as pessimistic as Philip, as realistic as Philip? Tell us your analysis and your prescription.
Well, Mark, thank you very much indeed for having me on, and I'll try to answer all of those questions. I would say that first and foremost, I don't think I've fallen into any of those myths which Philip has set out. My economic views remain as defined by the books you can see around me. But these are going to be extremely tough days. And I think if we were to say what our goal is for the public, it's life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. If you were to put it in one word, it is prosperity in the round. And I think Philip set out quite clearly the need to think about future generations too. We tend to be quite good about thinking of future generations when it comes to the environment, but perhaps we ought to also think about the fiscal environment we leave to future generations too. The situation is going to be extremely difficult. We had George Osborne before the Treasury Committee in the week, and he broke the news to us as if perhaps we hadn't realised already that this Parliament is going to be about the same kind of questions of public spending and taxation which dominated the 2010 Parliament. And let me tell you, as somebody who had their bottom on the hot seat throughout those 5 years, it wasn't a very comfortable place to be, and it's not going to be a very comfortable place to be in this Parliament, not least because I think that the Prime Minister is sick of austerity, members of Parliament are sick of austerity, and the public certainly are. And fear of tax rises, I'm given to understand in polling for another think tank, should there be such a thing, says that the fear of taxes is the public's main concern. They don't want to see taxes go up. And of course, our manifesto pledges that we will not raise the main rates of tax. For as long as anybody's been willing to listen to me in politics, about 10 years, I have been saying that we were still heading into a major crisis of political economy. And that's really my main message today. I think what this crisis has done, and as I'll show you in a moment, is catapult us forwards towards the crystallization of extremely difficult choices. I'll try not to repeat the things which Philip has said, but the OBHA's top lines, to put a different slant on Mark's introduction, they saw tax revenues go down by 42%, government spending rather going up by 52%. You obviously can't continue in that state. They are extraordinary circumstances, and all of public policy is bent at the moment to building a bridge across this tremendous shock to the economy. So I want to say something about the situation on spending, tax, debt and money, something about politics, something about expectations, and then what we ought to do. So I haven't prepared a presentation. I'm going to wave charts at you. There is the budget red book, where the money is going. Let's not pretend that cutting this spending will be easy, because about 2/3 of government spending is social protection, personal social services, healthcare and education. And of course, all of those areas of the public sector are looking for more money, more preparedness in the health service, more spent on education. So let's not pretend that cutting spending is easy, or that it will be welcomed. The last conference call I did was on motor neurone disease. Very difficult to tell people suffering from motor neuron disease that spending needs to be cut. But if we look at tax, turning to where the money is going to come from, I've been following the work of the economist David B. Smith, read a great publication, Living with Leviathan, for the IEA. He's also contributed some great economic history work for the 2020 Tax Commission. And working with David, if you look at factor cost GDP, which is his preferred measure, and look at the level of government spending today, or where it was before the crisis, compare it to the historic evidence for the taxable capacity of the UK economy, you find that they're both about at 38% of GDP on that factor cost measure, excluding oil revenues. The point is very simple, never mind the complexities in the numbers, that we're at the taxable capacity of the British economy. There is not much more to be raised by increasing taxes. That is going to be an extremely controversial proposition. There are good Laffer curve arguments about it, but I think when you look at the literature, there was that brilliant survey from the 2020 Tax Commission. We're far beyond the growth maximising level of tax. We're very far beyond the welfare maximising level of tax. We are very much at the practical limit. So if anybody wants to raise taxes, well, do tell us how that is going to work when it really has not in the past. If I can share the screen for a moment, I want to put in front of you the Fiscal Sustainability Report from the OBR. This was July, I now can't find it. Hopefully you can see the OBR's chart.
Yeah, the executive summaries on the screen, Steve.
Yeah,
Yep.
So you hopefully can see a chart there. The yellow line is public debt. Philip referred to this. You can see it's accelerating away on the right of the chart up through 275% of GDP, and there's the deficit increasing. This is just through age-related spending. Now, there's a little euphemism in here. Beyond this point, debt would remain on a rising path. That's the point of 282.8% debt to GDP in 2067 to 68. They say, needless to say, in practice, policy would need to change long before this date to prevent this outcome. So if you look at where the line there, that crosses, that dotted line unfortunately isn't at 100%, but if I fiddled with it earlier. We've been catapulted forward about 18 years on this yellow line, on this debt projection, by this crisis. What does that mean? It means that from here, debt was only ever going to be going upwards due to age-related spending promises. And in a sense, what this crisis has done is take away the headroom that we were expecting for the next sort of 5 years or so, where we might have got debt falling. So I think that this will crystallize really hard choices, which we weren't expecting for the best part of 18 years. That is an extremely serious place to be. If we look at some data on the real public debt, I haven't seen these numbers for a while. This table's out of the 2020 Tax Commission, but they looked at 2010 for an example. The official national debt was £890 billion. By the time you add unfunded public sector pensions, unfunded state pensions, the bank's debts, PFI, Network Rail's debts, nuclear decommissioning, the real national debt then was 7.8 trillion, or 560% of GDP. So if, like me and like Philip, you do care about the legacy you leave to other generations of what they need to fund, these are extremely serious circumstances. So the last point on these three is, in a sense, my favourite, because other MPs don't talk about it, is what have we done to our money? Well, Philip alluded to the collapse in the value of the currency. It seems to me evident that every time there is a crisis, we make money easier. And the pressure to do so is very plain on central bank staff. We've just had an expansion of QE at the ECB, and the Governor of the Bank of England has revised his position on negative interest rates. We see QE going up an extra 200 billion. Through a change to the counter-cyclical capital buffer, the banks will now be able to expand credit by an extra 190 billion. The COVID corporate finance facility, funded by new reserves, looks a little tiddler at only about 13 billion of new money. We're pouring new money into the economy. Now, most economists seem to be telling us that this crisis will be deflationary because of the various shocks to it. But I look at what's going on and I wonder if the stock of money might start rising soon. And we might find that actually in a year or so, perhaps a couple of years, we're looking at inflationary circumstances, and then we will face a moment of profound choice and consequence. If inflation is rising, the bank has told us they will pull the plug. They didn't use these words, but look at the session. They will pull the plug on a government bond market auction rather than let the inflation target be exceeded. So then that will be a moment of really profound decision for the Monetary Policy Committee, for the Treasury, for Parliament, because if they choose in a moment like that to change the remit of the Bank of England, then where will it lead? Because we've already got a member of the MPC, Dr. Vlega, saying that if you just look mechanically at what's being done, his words, not mine, they're comparable to the Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe. And it's only as they've told us, it's only because of the independence of the MPC that the bank is able to intervene in this way. So these are incredibly historic times. In order to preserve our monetary stability, we must preserve the independence of the Bank of England. That then provides the Chancellor with a fundamental problem. He faces circumstances in which he cannot allow a bond auction to fail. That means he needs to get the books looking far more like, if they're not balanced, they're going to be balanced. That is going to mean some amount of spending restraint. And while I and everybody else in my party stood on a manifesto that ended austerity and spent quite a lot of money, we're now going to have to look extremely carefully at what we're doing in an environment where, as Philip and Mark have indicated, members of Parliament perhaps don't want to face up to the reality and want to set it to one side. If I say what I think is going to happen and then what I think should happen, what I think will happen is we'll probably return as closely as we can to the manifesto programme. We'll sit on higher debt levels and hope that interest rates stay low, because that generally is the advice we get. And many of the hard decisions which that fiscal sustainability report points to will again be deferred. What do I think we should do? I would say three things: liberalise, liberalise, liberalise. Liberalise taxes, liberalise regulations, making sure we've got the best pro-competitive environment in the world, and liberalise international trade. I'm very happy to say on that last point, that's very much this government's direction of travel. Boris set out the vision beautifully recently. We are negotiating those FTAs, but in that regard, we'll need to carry the world with us. But the bottom line to all of this is we're going to need to carry the public, and that means we need to make an agenda of liberalisation attractive to everyone.
Steve, Philip, thank you very much. The questions are already lining up, and I'll come to those shortly. So do put your questions in the Q&A box. And even if you're not asking a question, if you've got a preference between the various questions asked, then please upvote those that you'd like me to ask, and I'll come to those shortly. Philip, I want to pick up a point that Steve made and begin with you there about the sort of day of reckoning, as it were. I mean, clearly, things which are unsustainable will not be sustained. Steve sort of suggested the crunch point, I'll come back to his thoughts on this in a minute, could be having to pull a bond sale or something. Are you of the view that on all of these graphs going in completely the wrong direction, as you were saying, that sort of all of the stars are aligning against us? You know, it's not as if we've got economic growth of 7% or we've been running surplus for 30 years. What do you think the day of reckoning is? Or do you think we just sort of stagger on, manage to decline, it used to be called, and we sort of just about sort of get through and make a few spending cuts here and there to see off the apocalypse, but that there isn't really a day of reckoning?
Well, I'd always thought until the COVID crisis that we would do just that. The governments would be forced to, liberalise, increase, take measures that would increase participation in the labour market, to raise tax revenues, that there would always be uncomfortable constraints on spending. And by uncomfortable, what I mean is that because of the natural tendency of health spending and other forms of spending on the aging population to rise, there will just sort of be a general squeeze in what government could provide with roughly the same amount of money. And no, as Steve said, pessimistic about the taxable capacity of the economy. My view was that we probably would just muddle along that way unless we really got a radical government that would liberalise regulation and reduce spending. In other words, reduce what the government was actually willing to provide in terms of transfer payments and goods and services. And that would just about work out okay whilst being pretty uncomfortable for the next generation. Because bear in mind that after 50 years, the trajectory of debt could then start to decline if you just take into demographics alone, because the problem is at the moment you've got the baby boom retiring as well as longevity increases, and there isn't a baby boom coming behind it. The following generation will be smaller. So you've got a sort of two things compounding each other, and I thought we'd just about get through it. But adding another 40% onto the national debt, no appetite for restraining spending, and so on, I think it begins to look much more problematic.
And just tell me then, what do you think if you think there could be a crunch point rather than just sort of staggering on, Philip, what do you think that crunch point is? Is it what Steve said, that they'd have to pull a bond issue? I mean, what would be the sort of that kind of key moment where the crisis becomes crystallized and clear for all to see?
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's so much the pulling a bond issue, because an auction is an auction. You could just set the auction and accept higher yields, and bond yields at the moment are very, very, very low. So I think the crunch point would be a rise in world real interest rates, which could happen simply as a result of a falling saving, a rise in investment, and a rise in the productivity of capital. So a rise in world real interest rates, which then affected the rates at which our government could borrow, and it then became very clear that government borrowing was unsustainable.
Okay, and Steve, let me come to you on your liberalise agenda. There's two elements of that I want to put to you. Do you think that this crisis and the economic aftermath of it might finally make deregulation something that happens? I mean, we continually hear, usually it's parties in opposition who promise a bonfire of red tape, and you're lucky if you even get a gentle smouldering of it when they're in office. But do you think that deregulation might take off? Because even though it's politically brave to do it, to let's say change labour laws or whatever, it doesn't cost money. These are supply side things that you could do to encourage growth in the economy. There's not the sort of trade-off of lowering taxes, potentially increasing the deficit. So do you think there'll be is deregulation now properly on the agenda rather than something that people just, give a nod to and never really see through? And secondly, on your liberalised tax, do you mean by that reduced tax? I mean, are you a dove in the sense that you'd be happy to see the total tax take drop even if the deficit rose? Or do you mean, let's accept the present overall burden of tax, but let's sort of rewrite the code somehow. Let's have a better, more sensible way of raising tax, even if it's the same total amount.
Right, well, thank you, Mark. I should just say that I agree with what Philip said about the bond markets, but do have a look at the evidence which we were given. I would definitely encourage people who are interested to have a look at the evidence which was given. I won't repeat it. Mark, in a word, deregulation is already happening. So one small example, letting pubs, which sell food, restaurants, sell for consumption off the premises required a change in planning law. Now, this is a small thing, but we mustn't be snobbish about small things, because small things will be very big in some people's lives. But how ever did we get to a situation where you could start a restaurant in this country, but you were prohibited by planning law from selling food for consumption off the premises? It's absolutely ludicrous, and our society is, I hesitate to say festooned, but it will have more examples of this than it ought to have. Over-regulation of taxis, for example, whether they're taxis or private hire vehicles, and where the labels have to go on the vehicle. And these sorts of things matter. If you're a taxi firm and you've bought vehicles and you want to deploy them as profitably as possible. So these sorts of deregulation are relatively small, but they loom large in the lives of those companies. And people ought not to be snobbish about their importance, because what we need to do is sweep through all sectors of the economy, looking for all of the opportunities to respect people's property rights and freedom of contract where they're doing no harm. I do not think it is for the state to restrict people's capacity to sell their food for consumption off the premises, for example. So on your second point, when I say liberalise tax, I want people to pay less tax, but of course I also want those who can't afford to pay for healthcare, education and other essentials to receive those things. We need to have a universal credit, and I would quite like to see universal credit better funded. I don't want to see a universal basic income, but I do think that universal credit needs to be a bit better funded. So all these things need to be paid for. But when I say liberalise tax, what really I'm driving at is the tax code is far, far too complex, as is well established. I really like the recommendations of the 2020 Tax Commission. I think we should be looking closely at those. But of course, I want to see people pay less tax, and I want to see incentives there for production, because in the end, what we all want to do is consume, and all consumption's got to be covered somehow by production. So let's maximize production, maximize people's incomes, and maximize our capacity to sell our production around the world through free trade agreements. So when I say liberalize taxes, what I really mean is take those steps necessary to maximize production.
Philip, can I just come to you, and then I'll come to the questions in the box on the deregulation point. Steve rightly says that you're probably looking at, a myriad of, in their own right, relatively small regulations. It's not as if allowing pubs to serve takeaway food is going to suddenly add, 5% to GDP growth. But if there are 100,000 such regulations, it can accumulate pretty rapidly. The problem I've always had with deregulation is often those that point to to some of the absurd regulations. The very absurd regulations are not those that would necessarily help economic growth. I can remember way back in the day, before he joined the government, Nick Clegg pointing out some absurd regulation that it was illegal to sell a grey squirrel, I think, in England. Well, we should probably scrap that regulation, but it's not as if the squirrel selling business will be what gets us out of the mire we're in. Whereas the more controversial ones, for example, making it easier to hire and fire workers, well, those suddenly run into controversy. So, Philip, what's your judgment about the impact deregulation could have and the potential appetite for some sort of bonfire of red tape?
Okay. Actually, I think George Monbiot, who we don't normally agree with, once cooked and ate a grey squirrel on Newsnight. So maybe there is quite a big market in grey squirrels. There's certainly plenty of them around where I am. But I think it's quite clear that you could easily add another 1 percentage point onto national income growth by liberalising regulation. And the biggest gain from this is obviously with the deregulation of the planning system. People often point there to housing, but actually it's not just housing, it's also business property as well. So there's been lots of studies done, for example, on the inefficiency of our retail system because of planning constraints, and how constrained our retail system is as compared with that in other European countries. So, yeah, a big deregulation could make a difference, but it's not going to be made up of things which people don't find very offensive on the whole. So there aren't 100,000 things such as the regulation that Steve just mentioned about pubs selling meals off premises kicking around that you could repeal that would increase growth by 1 percentage point. But there are some big things you could do. One of those is in housing. Another one is in employment law, removing lots of the regulations surrounding anti-discrimination and the particular way that's approached, which is not only a cost burden on business, but it also reorientates business away from its proper objectives towards meeting other objectives. One which is the bane of my life at the moment actually is GDPR regulations, taking an incredible amount of my time because they are used for a purpose for which they were never intended. And when somebody puts in a request for information, it takes a very large amount of senior staff time. So there's a whole range of things, but there are lots of vested interests protecting these regulations. But the good news should be that when as a society gets poorer, the things which it may value, which could be achieved by regulation, become less important as compared with other things, such as eating, be able to have a decent home, and be able to have a decent standard of living in other ways. There's a sense in which some regulations are kind of an income elastic good or service, perhaps, which people demand more of the richer they get. So if you're trading off income and regulation, and income falls, perhaps people want a bit less regulation and a bit more income in the future, so deregulation ought to be easier.
I know our good friend Alberto Mingardi from the Institute Bruno Leoni says that he thinks it's just a fact that everybody gets the amount of government they can afford. So if GDP goes backwards a bit, maybe we'll get a small state.
Yeah.
Steve, I know you want to come back on the planning point. Then
Yeah.
I really will come to the questions from the audience.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point. I chose the regulation I did because it's already being deregulated. It relates to the planning system and it was relatively uncontroversial. Now, there's businesses in Wycombe I could point to. There's a video on my YouTube channel about one of them where a building that had been used as a light warehouse was prevented from becoming a workshop over a planning rule that was well intentioned over about reducing noise, but it just resulted in a building standing empty instead of having a productive workshop in it, employing people, and that was devastating. I worked extremely hard on it, and it wasn't possible to get the planning system to move. And things like that, the planning system should just let property owners use their property as they see fit, and that should be the presumption that you can use your property as you see fit, provided that you don't impinge on others. The other point very quickly is on the record, people will find in Hansard that I agitated for radical planning system reform. I put as well as I was able a book called Liberating the Land by Mark Pennington, published by the IEA. I put that on the record in the midst of a political crisis in the planning system in my constituency, and I posited it as the answer to the problem, and it was incredibly popular amongst the affected voters. But I haven't got time to get into the detail now. I'm just making the point that provided we protect the built environment, the green spaces that we truly value, people will support planning system reform. I'm absolutely sure of it.
Okay, let me come to some of the questions, and I'll be democratic, just to assure you I'm being democratic. The most upvoted question just happens to come from the IEA's Honorary Vice President and former Chairman, Professor David Middleton, who suggests, Steve, I think that he would have liked the Conservative Party manifesto to be rather more radical than it was. Could taxes be reduced quite a lot by privatising government spending on both health and education?
Well, David, how grateful I am to you for that question, because, of course, real politics is not an academic exercise, and I'm well aware that this is going to be recorded and broadcast. And I don't have the luxury of great radicalism in my proposals. I've got to go for practical things. But what I would say is that in Wycombe, we've got one of the best private girls' schools in the country. We've got a cooperative school. We've got a wide range of schools here, and I think there's a lot to be said for mutuality. And I think if we could give people more direct control over their public services in health and in education through mutuality, that could allow us to get the public to reconnect with the cost of services and their quality, not merely the sort of broader service aspects like how far you have to travel to get an appointment, or whether the parking is cost or free, and so on. So I would like to see a lot more mutuality in our schools and in our hospitals. And I think by going through that path and engaging the public in what it actually takes to have these very expensive services, we might make progress in the direction you indicate. But in a sense, it's recapturing old traditions of the left. There was a really vibrant spirit of independence from the state on the left prior to the 1911 National Insurance Act. But saying that is about as radical as I can allow myself to be.
Thank you, Steve. Philip, your thoughts on this? Steve mentioned earlier that one of the problems, and you've often referenced this as well, with state spending is that huge tranches of it seem to be in effect ring-fenced. Social protection, pensions, education spending. On David's question, do you think that any meaningful effort to get public spending under control requires tackling those sacred cows rather than just sort of squeezing the grant of the Arts Council or whatever?
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually. We talked about austerity earlier, and that it hadn't really happened in total. You have these ring-fenced areas where spending increased, but other areas actually where spending reduced dramatically. And although you could argue that in areas such as prisons or even social care for those adults who can't afford social care, that it might actually have gone a bit too far and reduced the level of service that we're providing in those areas beyond beyond the right level. It hasn't led to catastrophe, despite the huge spending cuts in those areas. So perhaps there is actually significant scope for cuts in education. In fact, I'm absolutely sure there is in education, certainly in schools and also in the health service. So the question is, how do you achieve it? And if you're not going to get yes minister responses to proposals for spending cuts where the most important things are cut first in order to grab news headlines, then the best thing to do probably is, yes, to give the individuals using those services some responsibility for paying for them. Steve outlined how you might do that in health. I think we should have some co-payments in health, and we should move towards social insurance systems. That won't reduce spending dramatically that much over time in total. It will move spending from the government to the private sector. And when it comes to schools, well, Len Shackleton proposed in a chapter for the IEA that parents should perhaps pay for the first £1,000 or something like that, or actually not the first £1,000, the last £1,000 of the cost of schooling. After all, they pay for nursery care, and then when youngsters are a bit older, they pay for higher education through a loan system. So why shouldn't parents make a contribution between the ages of 5 and 18? And if the state made a certain fixed contribution, and then anything above that, perhaps capped at £1,000 or £1,500 or something, was paid for by the parents, then you get market signals to schools, which I'm sure would then perform much better. But not only that, if it's the last £1,500 that parents pay rather than the first £1,500, schools could then reduce their budgets and compete with each other on the basis of fees. But actually, I think the big gains are going to come from reducing spending on pensions and other support for older people, I'm afraid, which the Conservative Party has shamelessly allowed to increase simply in order to attract the votes of older people.
Yeah, can I just pick up on that point?
Please, Steve, yeah.
Yeah, you know, I recommend a very old book called A Politician in Sight of Haven, which deals with the stress a politician has in choosing between his own view, his constituents' view, and his party's view. But you know, the Wycombe seats had a maximum majority while I've been here of 14,000. It's now down to 4, and I know why that's happened. It's, you know, a huge surge to Labour in 15 that was carried forward to 17, and I lost some protest votes. And you know, if you wish to be a politician and wish to be elected, you've got to have regard to what your electors actually think. And so, you know, it's not merely to attract votes. It's a question of practical politics and public choice and being a representative. But this is why while I welcome David Middleton's question, you know, I think there's this acceptable window of public policy, and this conversation's part of shifting that window. But if you're a practical politician like me, you do have to have regard to what your electors think.
Yeah, I think if I could just comment on that. Yeah.
Very quickly, I just will tell both Steve and Philip, we've got 21 unanswered questions in 15 minutes. So be very quick, Philip, on your riposte.
Oh, okay. Yep. I mean, I think you could remove the triple lock and link pensions to either earnings or prices, using the current crisis as a reason to do that, and maybe get away with it now in a way you couldn't have done 5 years ago. But anyway, we'll see.
So let me come to the next question. Steve, you very fairly point out that you unfortunate elected representatives of the people have to live within the Overton window. It's the job of organisations like the IEA to try and shift the Overton window. I'm wondering if I can see on your camera whether that really is the Overton window just to your right shoulder that you have to sort of live within, but I totally understand the constraints you're under. Within that consideration, there's the next most popular questions from an anonymous attendee, perhaps one of your Conservative colleagues in Parliament, Steve. Do you think they're introducing a new tax, such as a mansion tax, a tax on housing, could help reduce the budget deficit and at the same time contribute to decreasing inequality? And you could broaden that out a bit, Steve, to thinking that whatever you think the overall tax take should be, do you think we've got the wrong burdens in the wrong places? You know, take a given level of tax take. Do you think perhaps more should be on housing or land and less on income, for sake of argument?
The idea of a mansion tax or any other tax on assets just for the sake of holding them is an injustice. The idea that having paid tax on your income of various forms and having accumulated some modest property like a decent house, the idea that you should then just be taxed on for the privilege of having that house, that would be an injustice, and I will not support it, and I'm absolutely clear about that. There is a real problem with house prices. I think it's bound up in the planning system and in the way that the financial system works. But the answer to it is not taxing. The typical example would be widows on low incomes in homes that they treasure because they brought their children up in them. And of course, anyone who cares about the cohesion of our society has to have some regard to inequality and equity in the round in our society. But the answer to it isn't taxing what capital people have accumulated simply for accumulating it. So I would not support that. We talk about the balance of taxes. The fundamental feature of our tax system at the moment is that taxes are about at their limit. And when you're up at the limit, the balance of our taxes is a bit slightly nonsensical question, because you're having a bump against the ceiling and saying, well, where should we go against the ceiling? Well, all the taxes are about as high as they can go. Can anyone really imagine going up from 20% VAT? I'd love to see VAT cut in half, but it's one of the three biggest taxes we have. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Philip, your thoughts on that, the balance of tax? I think you've been sympathetic perhaps to a tax on land values or imputed rent or something like that. Do you think there's more of a role for a different balance of tax, quite apart from lowering the overall burden?
Yes, I do. I think there's a case for a tax on something like the imputed rent from owner-occupied property for a number of reasons, which would remove distortions within the housing market between housing assets and other assets and so on. But it should apply to everybody, and it should also apply to it should probably apply to businesses in a similar way, although they already have rates which are in a sense trying to mirror the same thing. But actually our property taxes overall are quite high. They're just incredibly inefficient. So we have very high levels of stamp duty, for example. Taxes on transactions are very inefficient taxes. We have council tax. So I would get rid of all those other property taxes and replace them with a neutral tax on something like imputed rent, which was levied at a flat proportion of imputed rent, thereby not penalising proportionately much high value houses than lower value houses. But unlike the current council tax system, which actually charges a lower rate proportionately on high value houses and lower value houses, I would rectify that. I think that would lead to a more efficient way of taxing property. But probably, probably not more income.
Mm-hmm. Bernard Salmon asks, can Keynes help pay for the war on the virus? How to Pay for the War, A Radical Plan for the Chancellor of the Exchequer is a book by J.M. Keynes, published in 1940 by Macmillan & Co. Limited, if you're interested in the publisher. It is an application of Keynesian thinking and principles to a practical economic problem and a relatively late text. Bernard doesn't suggest which core principle of it he would like to rely on, but Philip, do you have any thoughts on that? And then I'll ask Steve the same question.
Well, I didn't have any thoughts on it, but one of the advantages of this format is that you could have a quick look to find out a bit of background, especially when the question was asked when Steve started speaking. So that gave me a couple of minutes. So Keynes' How to Pay for the War was issued towards the beginning of the war, and it really was about how to pay for the war during and just after wartime, rather than how to deal with the 30 or 40 years or so after. So he suggested things like price controls, higher taxes, borrowing, especially from our allies, and this type of thing. Well, we're borrowing in any case. I certainly wouldn't recommend price controls. You can and rationing. You can justify those in wartime because you might want to keep everybody at the same standard of living and use all the rest of your resources for defence and the war effort. But I don't think there's any close analogy really to what will be the aftermath of the COVID-19 situation. I think West Germany after the Second World War is a better analogy.
Steve, your thoughts on that? No, Keynes cannot guide us in this. I'm sorry if that is a disappointment. I've just picked up some Mises trying to find a pithy rebuttal to the ideas of Keynes. Keynes, of course, thought that the state shouldn't grow greater than 25% of GDP. So I think even if Keynes was around today at the height of his powers, he might concede that the state was a bit larger than he meant. He would be on the extreme free market end of the Conservative Party, indeed, Steve. He would be on the extreme free market end of the Conservative Party, indeed. That was a point I made shortly after I was elected at a dinner when people thought it was radical to suggest then that the government should be reduced by 5% of GDP. But
I'm sorry, I hold Keynes accountable for much that's gone wrong in economics since he transformed it. His errors of method and epistemology, I think, are at the heart of the gravest difficulties we face. Insert here the rant by Hayek at the end of The Pure Theory of Capital, where he described such economists as a grave menace to our civilization.
Couldn't have been clearer. Thank you, Steve. Steve, I'm going to start with you on this one because you mentioned the, if you like, the sanctity of independent central banks. Tom Packer asks, to what extent can independent central banks be justified when they are not following the targets? How is nationalised banking, where they can effectively ignore the targets, be justified in a democracy? I'm not sure if Tom spelt that wrong or I've misread it. But if the banks are ignoring the targets, I mean, it's completely undemocratic, isn't it? So restate the case for an independent central bank system, and how would you reform it from its
Well, I would
system?
recommend people actually read Walter Bagehot's Lombard Street, and relevant extract of which is on the Cobden Centre website, because I agree with Walter Bagehot in not supporting central banking at all. The reason that we have central banks is because they exist, and it's unimaginable that we should get rid of them. They are not a justifiable institution. They are the most dangerous form of socialism that we endure, because free marketeers support them. And it is madness that we have a central planning committee deciding what should happen with the medium of exchange. It is madness that people cannot see that the emperor has no clothes. We should not have central banks, and we only tolerate them because they are there. So in a sense, that is my very honest answer to the question. But like Bagehot, I have to be practical, since we do have them, the point I was making earlier is that the bank has told us plainly that they can only intervene in the monetary system in the way that they are doing, because people believe in the independence of the MPC and their willingness, if inflation started rising, to prioritise meeting their inflation target over making bond market succeed through QE. Because at the moment, of course, they are buying more bonds than the debt management office is selling. That is the arithmetic. So the point really I'm making is that I think central banks are the source of our woes in many ways, not the coronavirus, but the broader problems of political economy we have, made even worse by the reality that otherwise extremely free market people are willing to defend having centralized economic planning in the field which affects every aspect of the economy, and that is in money and bank credit. So I think the situation is absurd, but I've always taken that view.
So there you go, Philip Booth. An elected politician just out-radicalises the IA, doesn't just think the unthinkable, but says the unsayable. You think if you just tuned in, he was the think tanker. Do you agree with that analysis, or are you more of a middle-of-the-road politician when it comes to this?
I'm slightly more sanguine about central banks. So Steve is not only thinking the unthinkable, but saying that any other contrary view ought to be unthinkable too. But I am more sanguine about central banks. I think independent central banks in the absence of exchange control, so that you do have competing nationalized monies, have been reasonably successful. And certainly as compared with what we had in the 1970s, incredibly successful. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't be, a monetary system would not be more successful still if it followed Steve's pattern. But I do just want to defend independent central banks in the context of liberalized capital markets and the absence of exchange controls. But no, if they did not follow the inflation target, it would be a catastrophe. So the biggest gains to a government in terms of creating new inflation is when the public is really sure that the inflation target will be met, because that means the government can borrow at really low rates of interest. The government can then rip people off by creating inflation and devaluing its debt. And after the government has borrowed at low rates of interest. That's what the government did after the Second World War. But then the biggest losses for future generations are when the government and the central bank then tries to reclaim its credibility after having spent what is probably 40 years nearly since 1976 trying to regain its credibility. So I think I won't say the inflation target should be sacrosanct. I'm not against it being reviewed and revised in the right framework and context, but the Bank of England must stick to its inflation target.
Okay, gentlemen, we've got 3 minutes left. We're going to have to move to the quick fire round. So, 1 or 2 word answers would be appreciated here. Steve, let me start with you. An anonymous attendee asks, how effective is quantitative easing with dealing with the budget deficit?
I think that remains to be seen. It depends on all the consequences. At the moment, it certainly seems to be propping up government spending. But we await, I can't tell you what we're awaiting, but there is a question the governor raised at his last appearance on this very point, which I hope to probe with him later.
Okay, Philip?
It's the wrong instrument. So you should use quantitative easing as an instrument of monetary policy to try and hit the inflation target if you're fearing deflation, and then you should borrow money through the bond market to finance the government budget deficit.
Okay, next quick fire question. Is there a chance of a sovereign debt crisis arising? Another anonymous question. Steve?
Yes, I think as I indicated earlier, if inflation comes up, the bank will prioritise, they are absolutely clear, they will prioritise meeting the inflation target, and that could cause a sovereign debt crisis, I think.
Philip?
Yes, as I said earlier, if real interest rates rise, which could happen through phenomena which are totally out of our control, such as the level of savings and investment in Asia or other growing parts of the world, then yes.
Philip, I'll start with you on this one. A question from Millie Gray. How great is the risk of a liquidity trap due to the historically low interest rates?
That's an incredibly complex question because most people misunderstand what Keynes meant by a liquidity trap. But given the ability of central banks to indulge in quantitative easing, I think, and given the appetite of bond markets for long-dated bonds, I think the risk of a liquidity trap is very low.
Very
low. Defer to the economics professor.
Defer to the economics professor there. And then I'm going to finish on this question, which goes back really to David Middleton's opening question from the floor. Again, from an anonymous attendee. Again, perhaps it could be one of your colleagues in Parliament, Steve. Could it be possible to consider possible reforms to the NHS? Its godlike status and the threat of American healthcare seems to stifle any debate, yet the costs keep increasing. And just to add to that, we'll make sure we link in the chat to Christian Niemitz's paper on comparative healthcare and universal healthcare systems that arise in Europe. I mean, Steve, the NHS, I think it was Nigel Lawson who described it as our national religion. Do you think we get muddled in public debate between some of the principles that people might find attractive, that the care is universal, that you'll get treatment irrespective of your ability to pay, and the actual institution and mechanism of the NHS itself, which is surely at least a socialist worse even than the central banks that you so loathe?
Yeah, we do muddle up those things. I'm absolutely committed to making sure everybody gets healthcare. I don't advocate the American model. I don't know why. Well, I do know why the left are obsessed with it because it's convenient to them politically. But I don't know why anyone would adopt the American system of healthcare, and there's no chance of us doing so. My reforms would be in the direction of mutuality. If anybody wants to know more about it, there was a Civitas paper on increasing mutuality in the healthcare in the NHS. I didn't write it, but I did catalyse its being written. We definitely do need to have some reforms, but I'll give you one here. I'm absolutely thrilled with how brilliant Buckinghamshire Healthcare NHS trusts were in this coronavirus crisis. But however talented and brilliant the staff at the clinical commissioning group, it turned out we didn't need any clinical commissioning in this crisis. And I've never believed in commissioning things. Lots of high capital intensive industries don't require commissioning groups to commission how many cars are going to be available in 5 years. We don't need commissioning. We should just get rid of clinical commissioning groups and let the trusts meet the demand for their services just like any other producer should in a market. And so there's 2 reforms: mutuality, no more CCGs.
Philip, the final word goes to you on, do you think we could open up a debate on this sacred cow of the NHS as an institution?
Yeah, I think most of the recent reforms have been at the wrong end of the system. They've been at the commissioning and sort of producer end rather than the consumer and finance end. I think what I would probably do is to, as a first stage reform, ensure that the NHS was financed by a tax which looked something like national insurance, with with a corresponding reduction in income tax, but was charged on all incomes, including the incomes of older people who don't pay national insurance. So national insurance too, if you like. Currently, people think that national insurance pays for healthcare. It doesn't, except for a tiny portion of it. And then I think that's you've then kind of created a fiscal mechanism whereby you can then allow people to opt out of paying that perhaps and use co-payments and insurance alongside, or mutual organizations or whatever, and have some rebate of their national insurance contributions. But I think there is a good case for starting this process politically, and I think it would be acceptable politically to move towards a hypothecated tax, which we actually called an insurance, because once you move from national to national insurance, you can kind of move from to private insurance. You only have to change one word then, big word, but whereas the current monolithic, totally tax-funded system, funded out of general taxation, I think makes reform of the consumer side much more difficult.
Okay, gentlemen, we have run just a little over time. Thank you to all of our attendees for attending. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all of the questions. Thanks for putting so many of them in there. A good number of the publications that have been referenced, we've put up links to in the chat. If you haven't opened the chat, you can go and get the links there. Please do make sure, if you haven't already, that you go to the IEA's website, iea.org.uk, and sign up to our daily newsletter, very short email bulletin that comes out each morning, but will keep you appraised of these sort of events. Please also go to our YouTube channel, or if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, the notification bell. Please share and like the videos. Our next video is actually going to be broadcast live on YouTube at 6 p.m. this evening. The details of that have just gone into the chat. We'll be discussing the science, civil liberties, and the economics of COVID-19. So please do join us for that. Come one, come all. Most importantly of all, my thanks to Steve Baker MP and Professor Philip Booth for really drawing out the scale and the nature of the problem we face, but at least as importantly, coming up with so much clear thinking about how to address it and to extract ourselves from this extraordinarily difficult problem. Steve and Philip, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our attendees. Have a very good rest of your day. Over and out.
Thank you.